Hi, my name is Michael Smith. We're here today to introduce probably the continuation of the Water Sub-Conservancy show. And here I have the general manager of the Water Sub-Conservancy, Ed James. And we're here today to talk about drought.
Or the dry year that we're having this year.
Well, when we first talked about subjects for this show, we said, what's going on? Well, you said the main thing is drought. And that it needs to get out there, it needs to be talked about. And you sent me some questions, and is this the driest year on record? I thought, oh no, that's a tough one to start off with. Is it that bad?
Well, if you read some of the articles, and a lot of people talk about it, they've never seen it so dry. And we've had some wet years, and people tend to forget. But actually, this is not the driest year on record. We actually had some worse years in the past. The driest year of record is 1977. And that was the drought that was in California, went around even the West. That was the worst year. And if you look at the supply of water today versus back then, 77 was much drier than it is today. We tend to forget about that. Also, we have a lot more people here. And so the demands on the resources are a little greater than they were back then. So, of course, people's memories change a bit and their concept of how things look.
Well, I remember when I moved here about 10 years ago, I'm not sure, one of those years you were really advertising in Carson City that you need to not use water to the locals. And I was kind of shocked because the show we were doing then was taped in Carson City, and I really became aware of a problem. Is that what you're doing right now, too?
Well, the one thing, too, is interesting. If you look at, we have 11 major water purveyors in this watershed on the Carson River, and all of them are doing well this year. They're actually going by. A lot of them use strictly groundwater sources, so they're okay. Carson City has a combination of some surface supplies, some induction wells where they pump water from the river, and have groundwater wells. So what we're finding now is that this idea of water conservation and all that has been becoming more ingrained in the system of people. And so we're seeing these peak demands that were really high a couple of years ago are actually decreasing. So the community has actually been able to meet the demands in here. However, the agriculture community is the one that's really suffered. And we know a lot of farmers who stopped irrigating by June because they were out of water. And unless you had a supplemental supply, they're basically only getting one cut, maybe two at the most. So that's impacting a lot of the communities here, more agriculture, and then the environment, the wildlife and all that is suffering.
Well, I know we talked initially, actually a while back, about the river was already dry, and they didn't have to do the rafting that you wanted.
Right.
And I was kind of just upset about that because I really promoted it the year before, but we had that big snowfall.
Right.
So by the time we were talking about it, the river was done.
Yeah, if you remember a year ago, we had a lot of water in the river, and it was actually a very unique year because it was so cold in the spring that our snowpacks were like 400 to 1,000% of normal, just because it was so cold in the spring, and we had a great runoff for rafting and recreation. This year, there was only a couple days. I was only able to get on the river once myself because it was such a short window.
Well, I know you have that kayakers, little kayak.
Yeah, little kayaks and rafts.
We have some footage of you doing that. It's pretty good.
Yes. Well, yes. I'm getting a little older on that one, but it's a great opportunity for recreation. And we have some great rivers to run. On the East Fork on the Carson is very famous. A lot of people come down to run that. They got the hot springs. But some of the best whitewater is leaving from Carson City going into Lyon County.
Well, we have Pat Freed makes a lot of her living doing that.
Correct.
And, she takes even the fishermen to some of the fishery areas, and I don't know if is the fishing down as well because of the.
Well, I know
it has to be.
Well, I think it's still on East Fork. There is some.
Okay.
It's still flowing down. Just last week I saw fishermen walking up down there, so there's a lot fewer ponds to hit, but it's still good fishery down there. Now in the Carson Valley and down, it's pretty dry.
Well, since we talked about the subject last week, I've been looking around, and some of the fields have been cut, but I don't know if they're going to make the third cut because it looks so dry. Nothing's coming up.
Yeah, well, a lot of the farmers in this area have what they call supplemental supply, which are wells. And so they've been turning on their wells to irrigate their fields. The problem is they have to get an economic advantage there because it costs a lot more to pump.
Electricity.
Yeah, electricity and stuff like that. So some may decide just to go with the 3 cuttings and stop because it costs too much to turn on their wells.
Well, I don't know if some people even know it, but every time you turn on your faucet, you're burning electricity.
Oh, yes.
And that's people don't understand that for some reason.
Water is heavy, and to pump water up a hill is very expensive. And to pump it from the ground up is also expensive. So it is. I mean, that's one thing that's nice about Mother Nature. When it evaporates water and brings it and drops it off in snow, it comes down to us by gravity, and that's a much cheaper way of taking our water.
We're just not getting any rain.
No, it's very dry this year.
Well, this is a kind of a silly question, and I do appreciate you being nice to me with my silly questions.
Sure.
The Farmer's Almanac came out and said it's not going to be much of a winter. Is that something that you're researching that same area where they do all kinds of things with sunspots and things? And I don't know how it works, but it's been relatively pretty close since I've been aware of it.
Yeah, my wife uses that all the time.
Oh, okay. What'd she say about this upcoming water season?
Well, and people always ask me, is this going to be a dry or wet year coming up? And I say yes. I usually say, wait until I can tell you in April how it looks, because it's just so hard to tell. If you recall, this year started off really bad, but the year before, in fact, last October, I was in meetings in Churchill County, and we were concerned about flooding. We had 6 or 7 meetings down there just dealing how we're going to deal with, if we had a wet year, potential flooding in the Fallon area because Lahontan was so full. So we had plannings, we were dealing with the Corps of Engineers, all the stuff, and then Mother Nature said, ha-ha, well, I'm not going to give you any water. So it was every year is different, and that's one thing about the Carson. We have such limited upstream storage that really depend on Mother Nature. And also temperatures. If you have a very warm spring, the water is going to come off quicker. Like 2 years ago when we had a very cold spring, it stayed up and it was a much longer delay of the flow. So you really have to plan for it, and that's one of the things we try to do is plan for those futures.
Well, how long have you been doing this job? You seem to really know what you're doing. It's a lot of stress, though, isn't it?
Well, what's nice, I don't actually serve water to the individual homeowners. So the municipalities do all the stressing.
Oh.
And every one of them. And I'm really impressed. So I used to I was general manager for a water district down in Southern California, and I understand the issues. But over the years, I have seen these entities really do a good job, and I am real impressed of the 11 water entities. Some are smaller than others, some are bigger, but they all take it very seriously, and they do a very good job making sure that water supply is there.
Well, in Southern California, it wasn't all they had like ping pong balls in the water, so they will keep the storage areas from evaporating or something.
We didn't have to do that, no, but yeah,
I saw someplace. I mean, there's novel ways for keeping your backup storage water existing. Because I saw some other storage water the other day, and it had like black tarp, and I'm thinking, should you use black to have the water on top of the black one that evaporate? Then I thought maybe I have the wrong type of storage. And then,
well, that's more to seal it off so it doesn't seep into the ground.
Right.
So that's. But you have a lot of demands for the resources, and it always seems that when you're pulling your system very hard, you'll have a well go down. And that's probably the biggest stress this last year for a lot of the water entities was having system failures, which is typical. Sometimes you'll have a well, you're pulling it hard, and it'll sand or collapse, or the pump went down and you have to replace it, and that's when you're scrambling. But most of these entities this year were able to meet their peak demands.
And then these aquifers, can you go deeper? Or is that an option, or because that sounds expensive?
It is an option. It is expensive. If you're starting to pull it down too hard, you have a concern that you may be overdrafting your groundwater basin, and that would be a concern. Those are indicators you have to watch. If we see a continued drop in the water table, you're pulling from a deeper area, so it takes more energy to pull it up. The efficiencies of the wells go down, so it could have an impact on your ability to meet your peak demands.
Well, you had this other question I was afraid to ask you.
Okay.
It's one that I hear about all the time, and I kind of avoid it a little bit, but is this due to climate change? And that's a bit in debate. I've heard, initially I was saying something's happening with climate, and then the more I said it, the more people at TRP would beat me up saying 100,000 years ago, the Lake Tahoe had a forest of trees at a certain level. Right. I said, well, I guess that's true. It happened 100,000 years ago. But in my little period on Earth, this has been probably record heat for me. And I lived in Oklahoma and Florida and Atlanta, right. Texas, but this is hot, and it's Tahoe, where I'm living now. And then when I come down to the valley where I used to be, I spent 6 years in Gardnerville, and I worked in Access Carson City. It's hotter, at least to me. But maybe my perception's wrong, but it seems like there is some kind of change.
Well, there's impacts out there, but I think you have to realize that year to year is not climate change to itself. You know, if you looked at last year, people would say things got cooler because it was such a cold spring. This year has been very hot around the country and all that. But if you look at the records on Carson, it does fluctuate up and down, goes everywhere you go. And so you have those impacts. This year, you can't say, okay, because it's so hot and dry, it's climate change going on. Climate change is more of a long-term trend. And if you do look at the historic records, you'll find that we had dry periods and we had wet periods. Like Lahontan, you know, just 25,000 years ago, Lake Lahontan came up to almost the Dayton area. And now you have very little down there. We've had fallen leaf is a good example where they found trees down there that grew over 100 years. So we've had droughts that are probably lasting 400 years.
Actually, that Tahoe Expo had that submarine that did that work, and it's remarkable. And that's what you kind of think of. Well, this is an old planet, and there's been cycles like that for many thousands of years.
Yeah. On our short period, which is about 80 to 90 years of record, we are seeing a trend, and we are seeing less water, earlier runoffs, and so impacts there. So the trend is showing us some impacts to weather. But again, we're just talking about an 80-year period, and it may continue. So some of our planning is, what if this continues? What does that mean to the overall watershed? So we are doing some what-if scenarios right now.
Now, when you say 80, that's been the lifespan of keeping records?
Correct. You know, so you can go to tree corings and get long-term records, but for our water levels that we see in the area, that's what we're seeing.
So technically, it's like a drop in the bucket.
Correct.
For time.
Yep.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about this climate change, because I think we need to evaluate a little bit more. Thank you very much. like the law. Not like the law.
Oh yeah, Gene
Hi, we're back with Ed James of the Water Subconservancy, and tell you, that's a lot of important stuff we talked about in the first half of the show. But now I'd like to talk about the water supply and conservation and what we all can do to help each other, because it sounds like some of the habits that we had before are kind of helping this season.
That's correct. What's interesting is there's been a trend across the country, and I think people have been aware. You've heard of droughts the last couple of years in Texas and all that. But also, water rates have been going up. And so you're seeing a trend where people are taking lawn out, and so they're using less water, which is a good thing. I think you're seeing a lot more water awareness. In the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of homes were going in this area. Big lots, a lot of lawns were going in. And now that trend's starting to reverse itself. You're seeing those reductions. And you're seeing that in the peak demands. Now we're kind of coming down. So it's changing, and actually the water utilities are adapting to it. They had one trend going one way of how they're going to meet the demands, and now changing. It's interesting, Carson City, because it's been such a dry year, I just found out that they're running out of reclaimed water for the golf courses.
Oh, wow.
So they may have to tell them to cut back because they've had to use so much of that. So this has been a very dry year. Starting the spring's been dry throughout the entire year, and so demands have been up. And so it's interesting how we've been using these resources, and even our reclaimed water sources now are down.
Well, do you talk to people like Vern Crond of how he's doing with Parks and Rec and what's going on? Is that one of the measures of how your local parks people are doing too?
Well, and again, I give credits to all the water utilities. They are meeting the demands this year. Some people have said, are there going to be water restrictions? And we don't anticipate any water restrictions. Now, if next year is as dry as this year, all bets could be off. Water tables may be tapped and may be down. There could be some impacts there. We were lucky this year because a lot of the reservoirs were full now. In the upper watershed, we have very few reservoirs. But the Newlands project, which is feeds Churchill County in that area, was almost full going into the season. It's down now. People say, I can't believe how low it is. It has been a lot further down. In the 90s, it was down to 4,000 acre-feet of storage. They cut off irrigation in July in 1992. This year, right now, we're about 45 or 42,000 acre-feet of storage. So again, we're better off than some other years, but if we have a dry year, you can see some real impacts on that community.
Well, in your water service, do you have 6 counties? Is that what you have, 6 counties?
That's correct. We have, starts off in Alpine County, which is in California, which makes us a kind of a unique organization that we are also a bi-state organization. And that's where most of the water comes from in the Carson, is from the snowpack and runoff from that. Then we have Douglas County, Carson City, a little bit of Story County, Virginia City and all that comes into our drainage, Lyon County, and then into Churchill County.
Wow, and in your position, you monitor all these various communities, how they're dealing with drought right now?
Well, what we do is, again, we try to work with the communities. When something affects one or more, or 2 or more counties, then we're asked to get involved to deal with it. We have some water quality issues. What's been kind of funny is we've been working on this flood plan for last year.
Wow, and that's been fireworks.
Here we are, have a flood plan going in, and we're remodeling the floodplains, trying to get a better handle on it. And then you get out there and you see the river actually bone dry. And so it's hard to get something. We get new people moving in. They're thinking, well, I want to be close to the river. And this trend, we have a trend as human people to get closer and closer to the river. And then, of course, we have a flood. We have some impacts, and 97 is a good example. This area does flood.
I saw those pictures, and they're pretty shocking.
Yep.
A lot of people had their dream homes and beautiful views to the river, but the river doesn't stay the same.
That's correct. So, we're working on a drought plan. I'm working on a flood plan. So I got everything kind of covered right now. So.
Well, I remember living in the Gardenville region and your area, and just driving around, and you see a lot of water in some of these farms. It really came up, it's covering the roads and things, and then like right now, it's fire hazards. So
yes.
How do you communicate do you also communicate to fire people to be aware of certain levels of water?
Well, we've been, we don't do much with the fire. There's the Fire Safe Council and others, the fire departments. But it's an awareness. There was a real concern. We're still in the fire season, and we can have, because everything's so dry, We have to be really careful, especially in the Front Range here. If a fire breaks out, it could go for a long time in this area. So fire is a big concern.
Well, I know just this past summer with the fireworks, I was wondering if it gets too dry where you can't really have them in Carson City, and I know Gardnerville's even considering them. Isn't that kind of a danger to even think about them right now?
Well, again, you have to look at the grass fires. We've had a lot of fires in northern Nevada into the east part of Nevada, but knock on wood, right now we've been lucky in our forest areas. But people have to be aware that the fire season started real early this year. We had fires in Reno and other, back in January, which is unheard of, and so there is a concern. And if we have again a very dry winter, we could see fires throughout all winter long here.
Well, my sister moved to Colorado Springs before those fires happened, and it's been a nightmare.
Yes.
Now it's better, but it's really changes people's lives. And so you have 6 counties to take care of. That's just awesome.
Well, and again, the nice thing about the way we were set up is we have no regulatory authority, so we do work in a cooperative manner, and that's the goal here. And anything that we propose, we have to bring it back to the individual counties for them to adopt. And that's that working relationship where a county does a really good job of what they're trying to do, but how does theirs impact their neighbors? And that's where we try to bring that impact.
Well, that's why I called it fireworks when you mentioned the flood plan that was being fought over in Douglas County, because I went to your all-day workshops, and the guy who was doing the floodplain was pretty sharp, and his data was pretty good. And then they challenged it and they fought it, and I guess they're reassessing the flood plan that he had proposed before or something like that.
You're talking about the Douglas County lawsuit that they had with FEMA?
Yeah.
They're going through that where they remapped the floodplain. One of the concerns, and this is where we're trying to get, and actually we have an agreement now with FEMA, we call it the charter, where in the past FEMA would come down, they'd do their flood mapping, but they would hire an outside firm, they would take the lead and develop the program. Next thing you know, it's dumped upon you. You have a chance to respond to it, but it's kind of an impact at the last minute. FEMA realized over the years when they used to do everything by county that it may not always work, that you should be doing it by a watershed. So that's what they call a charter program, where they start trying to work locally on a watershed-wide basis. And we signed an agreement with FEMA. We are the first ones in Region 9, one of the few in the entire country, dealing flood issues on a regional basis. And now FEMA is a partner with us, not the lead tenant, but a partner helping us dealing with the flood issues. And it's really critical to understand that flooding impacts this country. Each year they plan $3 to $4 billion of damage due to floods. Katrina was much higher than that. In fact, what people don't realize that when Katrina went through, FEMA ran out of money and had to borrow over $15 billion from the federal government to pay off their expenses. So that's some of the issues going on. So, when we start talking about droughts, you have to realize we're in a desert and stuff like that, but at the same time, you can have flooding. And it's very possible that we could have a flood this year in the wintertime and then have a drought in the summer.
Well, yesterday I drove by to see what the new Walmart's doing in Douglas County, and it's a lot of ground being covered up that wasn't covered up before.
And that's some of the things we're looking at too. Because when we deal with flooding in this watershed, we don't have canals, we don't have channels, we don't have upstream storage. So we really depend on what Mother Nature gave us originally as those floodplains, where the agricultural community's at. And that is the best thing you want, is to keep those. If you don't believe that, look at what's going on in the Truckee, where they did bring in the city, everything encroached upon it, so they channelized it, and there still is some major flooding, and they're talking about $500 million to $1 billion to try to fix a program that we currently have in place today. So we got to preserve that.
Well, the water, was it the Nature Conservancy spent a lot of money helping that, the Truckee? Because I mentioned, here's one of the questions you had for me, that was, why does the Truckee have so much more water than the Carson River? I don't know.
Well, and that's a lot of times people say, you look at the Truckee, you see water flowing down there. Well, one of the things I would say is Lake Tahoe. They have Lake Tahoe, and then they also have Boca, Stampede, Independence. They have a lot of upstream storage. We do not. The top 6 feet is what can be stored in Lake Tahoe, and those top 6 feet store the equivalent of 2 years annual runoff on the Carson.
Wow.
So, we have very little upstream storage. We are looking at trying to maximize those resources to have some kind of in-stream flow in the future. But a year like this, it's very hard. You're not going to be able to find it. The river's going to go dry, and this has been going on since we started developing when White Man first came into the area.
Well, we have another quick question before we're going to go. Is what about the water restrictions for next year? Do you already probably see that we're going to have to maybe tighten our belt even more?
Well, we'll have to see how the year goes. Again, the communities have planned for it, but if we get a very dry year, we don't get a good winter, you may start seeing some restrictions in place in some places in this watershed.
Well, we're down to a minute and a half. Probably should get some contact information out.
Sure. If you want to know more about projects that we're working on with the communities, we have a website, and that website is cwsd.org, and we have a lot of information on that about flooding, education and water resources. So people can contact that, and if they want to call our office for any information, our phone number is area code 775-887-7450.
And lastly, I think we have about a minute left. We talked on break about my frustration with watering my yard. I don't know how much to use. I can get something that measures my water coming out of my outside faucet. And where do I get that at?
You can go to any hardware store should have that information. If you want more information, we actually have a drought plan and give information. A lot of times they say, only water what the plant needs. Well, a lot of times people say, well, what does that mean? Where do I get that information? So you can go to our website. We have some links on that and provide information to people. Because being educated, living in the desert, is the most important things to avoid waste. And that's the key thing. If you can do your bit to avoid waste, you can still have a nice looking yard with some vegetation around it. And you don't have to turn everything into rock.
Right, and there's a lot of good Nevada landscaping guides
Yes.
that my neighbors who did it right when I lived in Gardnerville, you can make your yard look pretty darn good. Well, thank you for inviting me to be in part of your return for your Water Subconservancy show, and I really appreciate it.
Yes, well, thank you for having us here.
This has been Michael Smith, guest host for the Water Subconservancy.